Welcome, folks, to the third and final episode of my G.I. Joe Jeep Rehab series. In the previous two episodes, I purchased and manufactured detail parts to make my G.I. Joe Jeep more closely resemble the Jeeps I drove when I was in the SALH 45 years ago. In this episode, I break out the spray paint and paint the Jeep, reassemble the Jeep, and then add some final touches. So let's get going! To make painting the Jeep a lot easier, any part that could be removed was removed. However, the hinges for the Jeep were on very tightly, so I decided to keep the hood on rather than risk breaking 60-year-old plastic. Before being sold to me, my G.I. Joe Jeep must have spent the majority of its life outdoors. As I was working on it, I found sand, grit, plant matter, and even cobwebs tucked away in odd parts of the Jeep. And my sanding work even added more grit. If the paint was going to have a chance of adhering to the Jeep and not look like a total mess, it was time to give the Jeep a good bath. For the small parts I removed from the Jeep, I got out a wash basin and thoroughly washed them down with liquid dish soap, then rinsed off the soap before setting the parts aside to dry. For the main body of the Jeep, I set up our little dog's wading pool in the backyard, added some liquid dish soap, and sprayed away with the garden hose. And gave everything a good scrubbing to make sure all the grit was gone before giving the Jeep a thorough rinse. The time had come to start painting the Jeep. I decided to go with Rust-Oleum spray paint after confirming online that its formula was safe for use on plastic. My research indicated that Rust-Oleum is a thicker paint that can hide small details on scale models, but the G.I. Joe Jeep is so large that the detail parts are big as well, so that this did not present a problem. I decided I wanted the undercarriage of the Jeep to be black, including the wheel wells. Since black is a very hard color to overpaint, I had to mask the upper body of the Jeep to prevent the black paint from getting on there. Once the masking was in place, I got out the Rust-Oleum black paint and sprayed away. I put on 3 coats of black on the undercarriage, allowing a couple of hours between coats for the paint to dry. It was a very hot day outdoors on the days I painted the Jeep, so this was plenty of time for the paint to dry. After the black paint dried, I got out the masking tape and masked the wheel wells and any part of the undercarriage where paint might get on the black paint before going back outside to put on a coat of primer on the Jeep and the detailed parts. I put on a coat of primer as it is far easier to get a consistent color using light colored paint if everything is the same color to begin with. Also, I wanted to make sure the parts made of sheet metal would accept the final colors of paint without peeling, which primer helps to prevent. I then set the Jeep aside overnight to allow the primer coat to fully dry. After I left the SALH in 1979 and joined the service battalion, I was assigned a deuce-and-a-half truck, which I was directed to paint. I was given 3 cans of what looked like house paint and a paintbrush and told to go for it. I remembered there was 2 shades of green paint and 1 can of black, which I painted over the existing paint pattern on the truck, sort of like a giant paint by numbers set. Brushing on the paint left a very dull finish on the truck, which is what you want with camouflage, as shiny paint will not blend as well with the background. After looking around at the various spray paints both for the hobby and commercial use, I decided to go with Rust-Oleum Camouflage Green for my Jeep. I could not find a second green paint I liked, so I only went with the one shade. Again, I was painting outdoors on a very hot day, so I added 2 coats of the green paint with about an hour's drying time between coats before setting everything aside overnight to fully cure the paint. I found an old pattern diagram online that was issued by the Canadian Department of Defense, showing their suggestion for camo on a Jeep, but it called for 2 shades of green plus black, and I decided to go with just army green and black. So I went ahead and winged my camo pattern to suit me. I purchased some very narrow masking tape used to pinstripe cars and used it to outline the area I wanted to paint black. I then masked all the areas that were to remain green before spraying black paint, which I did with 1 coat to minimize the chance of bleed through under the tape. The time had come to remove all the masking tape. Before this step, I was worried the army green paint was too light in shade, but as the black camo pattern was revealed, everything looked just right. Now that the Jeep was painted, it was time to put it back together, starting with the wheels. I inserted the hubcaps in the wheels, making sure the little brass bearings were put in the hubcaps. I inserted the axle with half the wheel assembly in place. To lock the wheel assembly in place, I used top hat rivets used to repair Tonka toy vehicles. As I said in episode 1, these rivets are super hard to remove, so it was important that everything went well the first time. On each side of the axle, a spacer is placed, followed by the wheel, ensuring the brass bearing on the back side of the wheel is in place, followed by the hubcap and the second bearing. It is time to install the top hat rivet that must be driven home with even force around the base of the rivet. I used a small socket to do this. After setting the rivet in the socket over the axle, it is driven home with a hammer. And now the Jeep has its feet again, hopefully for another 60-some years. I was coming into the home stretch with my G.I. Joe Jeep project, as it was a time to assemble all the completed and painted parts. I added a black Velcro cable strap to the jerry can holder to keep the jerry can in place. With a final twist of the wing nut, The antenna mast and spare tire were in place. Next to go in was the back seat. I painted the seat cushions chestnut brown, followed by the rear access panel. Next up was the steering wheel. On the windshield, I laid down a thin bead of white glue, into which I set down a piece of clear plastic. The white glue dries clear and doesn't mar the clear plastic. Next up, the headlights went on. I added some plastic behind the grille to prevent you from seeing right into the grille and finding out there's no radiator or engine under the hood. The wire cutter went on next. Time to add some extra little touches, starting by adding amber jewels I obtained at a local craft store to the front turn signals. And ruby jewels to the rear lights. And the rear side marker lights. I painted a couple of pieces of paper towel chestnut brown and used them to make seat cushions for the front seats that I glued in place. I went online and found a photo of the data plates installed on these military Jeeps. I reduced the size of the image and printed it out on plain paper, which I glued on the passenger side of the Jeep under the panic bar. I also found an image of the gauge cluster for military Jeeps and reduced the size and printed it out on plain paper, which I also glued to the dash. When I painted the Jeep, I sprayed army green paint onto a bit of paper. After it dried, I scanned it into the computer to make homemade stickers that would be on a background that matched the body color of the Jeep. The little black Canadian flags I glued to appropriate areas on the Jeep. When I was doing research online about these little Jeeps, I came across this photo of a Jeep with a strange symbol on it. According to Wikipedia, it is one of the symbols used by NATO to designate friendly units. In this case, it indicates that the Jeep belongs to the Royal Canadian Hussars, which is a regular force unit based out of Montreal, and that it is an armored reconnaissance unit. Since I have this large square area on the front bumper of the Jeep, I thought this would be a neat thing to put the NATO symbol for the SALH there. The symbol designates a motorized reconnaissance unit. Since the Canadian Armed Forces have to operate vehicles across Canada and internationally to perform its mission, it has a very unique licensing system that is totally independent to the various provincial license and registration systems. For one thing, your civilian driver license doesn't qualify you to drive any military vehicle. The military license, known in my time in the military as a 404, is what is required. Additionally, you have to qualify on each and every vehicle you're going to drive in the military. In my case, when I left the militia in 1982, I had qualifications of my 404 to drive the quarter-ton Jeep, staff car, 1-ton truck, half-ton panel van, and deuce and a half, and I had to take and pass a separate road test for each of those vehicles. Also, as part of this independent vehicle registration system, the military doesn't use provincial plates on its various vehicles, but uses Canada license plates. So I added these to my little Jeep as well. And finally, on went the windshield. The Jeeps I drove in the SALH were considered to be combat vehicles, though how well they would have done against the Soviet Red Army if the balloon had gone up in the 1980s is something we will never know, thank goodness. Regardless of that, to train to fulfill this combat role, we had weapons on board the Jeep when on exercise at the Canadian Forces training areas at Dundurn, Saskatchewan and Wainwright, Alberta. Let's take a look at what was available to arm these Jeeps. These Jeeps all had the anchor for the mount for the Canadian version of the venerable M1919 General Purpose Machine Gun, bored to fire 7.62 NATO ammunition, and I built this mount for my little Jeep. However, as I stated in episode 2, mounting the GPMG on the Jeep almost never happened, as in the late 1970s and early 80s there just were not enough machine guns to do so, and I saw a Jeep armed in this configuration only once during my service in the militia. So what weapons did we have to fulfill our mission? Our primary firearm was the FN-C1A1, designed by the Belgian company Fabrique Nationale and built in Canada under license, which was the Canadian military's main rifle from when it was introduced in the 1950s and was in service until the mid-1990s. I found a scale model of the FN on eBay made by Faruda. It is more typical of the FNs used in Europe, but comes close enough to arm my G.I. Joes. The other weapon we commonly carried was the SMG C1, which was a version of the British Sterling submachine gun, chambered to fire 9mm Parabellum pistol ammunition. I was able to acquire on eBay a very nicely detailed model of the SMG. I am showing the SMG on the back seat of the Jeep as it reminds me of a story. One time while on exercise in Wainwright, we were bounding through the boonies when the commander looked back and said, Rob, didn't we have an SMG on the back seat? We had to turn the Jeep around and go on a treasure hunt. Luckily, we found the SMG only 100 feet back on our path. The Jeeps we drove also had an antenna mast by the spare tire for a mounted radio, but again the militia normally didn't mount the radio in the Jeep. Instead, we normally carried the PCR-77 Manpack radio in the Jeep. I found and ordered a scale version of this radio on eBay, but unfortunately it didn't arrive in time for this video. Before we move on, I think this would be a good spot to compare the Jeep as it was when I got it to what it is now. And so my project was complete. After long and honorable service with a little boy fighting the battles of the sandbox, it was time for this little G.I. Joe Jeep to start another life as a display on a bookcase in my home office. I hope you enjoyed my three-part adventure restoring an old G.I. Joe Jeep. It was definitely the YouTube project that has taken me the longest to complete, as I started it 4 months ago when I first put in the order with eBay to purchase the Jeep. It brought back many happy memories from my time in the militia many years ago. Till we meet again, everyone keep safe and well.